Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The Vanishing Hiker of Mount San Jacinto. It was the early morning of December 3rd, 2016, when Mark Thompson and his two friends, Lily and Ben, set out for a hiking trip on Mount San Jacinto. They had been planning the trip for weeks, hoping to experience the breathtaking views of the snow-capped peaks and rugged terrain that this mountain was known for. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for a winter hike in the San Bernardino Mountains, so they were eager to get started. Mark was an experienced hiker, having trekked through numerous trails in the Sierra Nevada and the San Gabriels. Lily, his childhood friend, was an avid outdoors enthusiast, and Ben, a newcomer to hiking, had only recently started developing a love for the sport. The trio felt ready for the challenge ahead. They gathered at the base of the mountain in the town of Idlewild, a small, picturesque village known for its proximity to the San Jacinto wilderness. The mountain trail, known as the Skyline Trail, began at the heart of Idlewild and twisted its way up through the dense pine forests and rocky slopes. As they made their way up the trail, the crisp morning air filled their lungs, and the smell of pine and earth was overwhelming. The sun slowly climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The temperature was cold but not unbearable, and they were all dressed warmly, anticipating that it would drop as they ascended. The higher they climbed, the more isolated they felt. The trees grew thicker, and the sound of their footsteps on the snow-covered trail was muffled by the deep silence of the wilderness. It was as though the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After several hours of hiking, they reached a plateau where they decided to take a break. Mark checked his watch. It was just past noon. He pulled out a map and looked over it, making sure they were still on track. The summit of Mount San Jacinto was still several miles away, but they had made good progress. "This place is incredible," Lily said, her voice full of awe as she looked around. The view stretched out in all directions, with snowy peaks on one side and the desert below on the other. Ben, who was slightly out of breath, sat down on a rock and took a sip of water. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his eyes wide. Mark smiled, enjoying the moment. He had been on many hikes, but there was something special about this one. Perhaps it was the stillness, or the fact that they had all made it this far together. But there was an eerie sensation creeping into the air. It was hard to explain, but something about the quiet felt wrong. They continued on, the trail narrowing as they ascended further into the mountain. The trees began to thin, and the air grew colder. As they neared the summit, the wind picked up, and the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. Snow began to fall gently, dusting the ground and creating a soft, white blanket over the rocks and dirt. It was then that Mark noticed something odd. There was no sign of other hikers. They had passed a few people earlier in the day, but now it felt as though they were the only ones on the mountain. The emptiness of the place began to sink in. It wasn't just the absence of other hikers. It was the silence. Not the kind of peaceful silence you might expect in the mountains, but the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. At around 2 p.m., they reached a clearing just below the summit. The snow was falling harder now, and visibility was limited. Mark suggested that they turn back, as they had been on the trail for several hours, and the weather was starting to take a turn for the worse. But Lily, always the adventurer, wanted to push on. "I'm so close to the summit," she insisted. Just a little farther. Mark hesitated. He didn't like the idea of continuing, but he didn't want to discourage her either. After a brief conversation, the group decided that Mark and Ben would wait at the clearing while Lily made a quick trek to the summit. "Be careful," Mark said, his voice laced with concern. He watched as Lily, determined and confident, disappeared into the snow, heading up the final stretch of the trail. Hours passed. Mark and Ben sat huddled together in the clearing, growing more concerned with each passing minute. The snow continued to fall, and the wind howled through the trees. The visibility was almost non-existent, and the temperature dropped sharply. "Something's not right," Ben muttered, his voice low and anxious. "She should have been back by now." Mark nodded, his stomach tightening with worry. It wasn't like Lily to take so long. He checked his watch again. It was nearly 5 p.m., and the light was beginning to fade. "I'm going to look for her," Mark said, standing up. Ben followed him, but neither of them spoke as they made their way up the trail, searching for any sign of Lily. The mountain was unforgiving in the snowstorm. The trail was almost impossible to follow, and with each step, the wind seemed to grow fiercer. Mark called out for Lily, his voice carried away by the howling wind. There was no answer. They continued for what felt like hours, pushing through the snow, but they found nothing. As the darkness began to set in, Mark felt a sense of dread creeping over him. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The silence, the eerie stillness. Something was terribly wrong. Then, just as they were about to give up and head back, Mark caught a glimpse of something in the snow. A footprint. But it wasn't Lily's. It was fresh, the snow around it disturbed and soft, as if something or someone had just passed by. Mark's heart raced as he knelt down to examine it. It was large, too large to be Lily's. He glanced at Ben, whose face had gone pale. "What the hell is that?" Before Mark could answer, they heard something. A faint, distant cry. It was a sound so faint that Mark wasn't sure if he had imagined it. It came from deeper in the mountain, beyond where they had been searching. "Lily?" Mark called out, but the wind carried his voice away, and the cry grew quieter. For a moment, it felt as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. The air was thick with tension. Mark made a split-second decision. "We're going back to the clearing. We're not getting any closer in this storm." But just as they turned to leave, Ben froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Mark turned, his heart pounding. There, in the distance, he saw someone moving. It was a figure, stumbling through the snow, barely visible in the swirling storm. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Is that?" He started, but before he could finish his sentence, the figure disappeared into the snowstorm. "Lily?" Mark shouted, his voice desperate, but there was no response. The snowstorm intensified, and the darkness of night closed in around them. Mark and Ben hurried back to the clearing, but Lily was still nowhere to be found. They made the decision to descend the mountain and seek help, but the uncertainty of what had happened to Lily, and the strange figure they had seen, haunted them the entire way down. A silent night in the Yosemite wilderness. It was the night of November 21st, 2014, when Sarah Evans, an avid hiker from San Francisco, decided to venture into the Yosemite wilderness for a solo hiking trip. She had spent months planning the trip, researching the best trails, and reading stories from fellow hikers who had explored the vast, majestic park. Yosemite, with its towering granite cliffs, tranquil lakes, and ancient sequoias, had always been on Sarah's bucket list. This was her chance to experience its beauty firsthand. The weather forecast had been clear for the weekend, with temperatures hovering just above freezing at night. Sarah was used to backpacking in all kinds of conditions, and she felt confident that she was prepared for whatever the wilderness could throw at her. With her tent, sleeping bag, and provisions packed, she set off from the Yosemite Valley on her chosen trail, the Sunrise Lakes Trail. It was a moderate to strenuous hike, but the view from the lakes, she was told, was well worth the effort. Sarah had hiked solo before, enjoying the solitude and peace that came with being surrounded by nature. She loved the rhythm of her footsteps on the dirt trail, the way the trees whispered in the wind, and the occasional sighting of wildlife. Yosemite, however, felt different, almost too quiet. There was a strange stillness in the air, a sense of being watched, but she brushed it off as just her imagination running wild. The park was vast, and it wasn't uncommon for people to feel a little isolated, especially at night when the sounds of nature took on a more haunting quality. As she ascended the trail, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Sarah felt a rush of excitement as she reached the first of the Sunrise Lakes. The reflection of the trees and cliffs in the still water was breathtaking. She took out her camera and snapped a few pictures, but something about the place made her feel uneasy. The air had grown colder, and the lake was eerily quiet. No birds chirped, and there were no rustling leaves in the trees. Everything felt unnaturally still. Despite the unsettling feeling, Sarah set up camp near the lakes, carefully choosing a spot near a large boulder for shelter. She built a small fire to keep warm and prepared her dinner, savoring the solitude. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the night air, but the silence around her felt heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence she had hoped for. There was a weight to it, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As darkness settled over the wilderness, Sarah found herself staring into the flames, her thoughts wandering. She thought about the long journey ahead and how much she had been looking forward to this adventure. But as she sat there, a strange sensation crept over her, a feeling of being watched. She turned her head, scanning the trees and shadows around her campsite. But there was nothing. Her mind played tricks on her sometimes, and she told herself it was just the isolation. She picked up her book, trying to distract herself, but the words on the pages didn't register. Her mind kept returning to the silence that surrounded her. It was as if the forest had gone completely still. No wind, no animals, no sounds of nature at all. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her. She decided to crawl into her tent to get some rest, hoping that the morning light would bring a sense of clarity. As she lay there, staring up at the ceiling of her tent, the quiet seemed to grow even more oppressive. She could hear her own breathing, the sound of her heartbeat, and the occasional crack of a twig in the distance. But then it happened. A low, distant sound reached her ears, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind. She sat up in her sleeping bag, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, but still faint. It was a low, melodic hum, as though something was singing in the distance. Sarah's heart raced. She had been hiking for years, but she had never heard anything like this before. It was too eerie, too unnatural. She unzipped the tent cautiously and poked her head out, scanning the area around her campsite. The trees were still, the air dead silent. The fire she had built earlier was nothing more than a faint glow now, casting long shadows across the ground. But the humming continued, growing louder. It was coming from the direction of the forest, deeper into the wilderness. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should she investigate? Should she ignore it and stay inside her tent? But the curiosity gnawed at her, and despite the growing unease, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside. The humming echoed through the trees, almost hypnotic in its cadence. It wasn't like any animal call she had ever heard, nor was it the sound of the wind. It was a human-like sound, but too distant, too strange to be of any person. Sarah's breath fogged in the cold air as she walked toward the sound, her footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The deeper she ventured into the forest, the louder the hum became, but the source of it remained elusive. The moon was high above now, casting an eerie light through the canopy. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but the hum continued to draw her in. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally came to a small clearing, and there, in the middle of the open space, she saw it. A figure. At first, she thought it was a person. A hiker, perhaps, who had wandered off the trail. But as she drew closer, her flashlight illuminating the figure, she realized it wasn't a person at all. The figure was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and its long, spindly arms hung loosely by its sides. The hum was coming from its mouth, though it didn't seem to be speaking or singing in any language Sarah recognized. The sound was almost like a chant, a strange, rhythmic drone that reverberated in the air. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body refused to obey. The creature's head slowly turned, its eyes glowing a faint, unnatural yellow. It stared directly at her, and for a moment, everything in the forest seemed to stop. The humming ceased, and the world was silent once more. Then, with a sudden and unsettling movement, the creature stood up straight, its body elongating, and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran. She sprinted back through the forest, her feet slipping on the icy ground as the adrenaline surged through her body. Her flashlight bobbed wildly in her hand, casting erratic shadows across the trees. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, soft but steady, following her. She didn't dare look back. As she reached the edge of the clearing, she felt a sharp pain in her side as her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling into the snow. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the footsteps was closer now, and she could feel something moving in the darkness just behind her. With every ounce of strength, Sarah pushed forward, her heart racing as the silhouette of her tent finally appeared in the distance. She reached it, collapsed inside, and zipped it shut as fast as she could. She was safe for now, but the humming, the creature, the silence that followed, it all lingered in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to block it out, the feeling that she was not alone in the wilderness haunted her. The phantom of Devil's Backbone Trail. It was the fall of 2018 when John Miller, an experienced backpacker from Los Angeles, decided to tackle the infamous Devil's Backbone Trail in the San Bernardino Mountains. The trail, known for its rugged terrain and eerie, narrow ridges, had always intrigued John. It was said to offer some of the most stunning views in Southern California, but it also had a reputation for strange occurrences. Stories of lost hikers, unexplained sounds, and ghostly sightings were common among those who had ventured into the area. John had hiked alone many times before, and he was no stranger to the wilderness. However, there was something about the Devil's Backbone Trail that unnerved him. Maybe it was the isolation, or perhaps the unsettling stories that surrounded it. But when he arrived at the trailhead that crisp October morning, a sense of unease washed over him. He shrugged it off, attributing the feeling to his imagination. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, perfect hiking weather. John shouldered his pack and set off, eager to explore the trail. As he hiked along the narrow ridge, he couldn't help but feel that the mountain was watching him. The cliffs on either side seemed to tower over him, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that sounded almost like voices. The trail was a challenging one, weaving through steep inclines, rocky outcroppings, and thick forests. The higher John climbed, the more isolated he felt. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves were absent. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around midday, John reached a particularly narrow section of the trail, a sheer cliff to one side and a steep drop to the other. The wind had picked up, and he could feel it biting through his jacket. As he carefully made his way across the ridge, he glanced down at the jagged rocks below. Something caught his eye, a flash of movement. It was quick, but he was sure he saw something shifting at the base of the cliff. He stopped in his tracks, heart racing. He peered down into the valley below, but there was nothing there. Just the rocks, the trees, and the empty expanse of the wilderness. Shaking his head, John told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had been hiking for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to him. He continued on, determined to reach the summit before dark. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and the silence deepened with every step. It wasn't until late afternoon that John finally reached a small clearing just below the summit. He decided to take a break, pulling out his water bottle and sitting down on a large rock to rest. As he sat there, catching his breath, he heard it, a soft sound in the distance. It was a low, mournful moan, almost like the wind, but not quite. He stood up, straining to hear. The moan came again, louder this time, followed by a series of what sounded like footsteps. The noise was coming from the direction of the summit. John's heart began to race. The trail was known for its solitude, and he hadn't passed anyone all day. Who could be up there? The sound of footsteps grew louder, but there was something wrong about it. The rhythm was irregular, almost dragging. It was as though the person, or whatever it was struggling to move but still coming closer. John felt a chill run down his spine. He grabbed his flashlight from his pack and made his way toward the summit, cautiously calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, only the sound of the dragging footsteps. They were getting closer. With each step, the moaning became clearer, and John could now hear what sounded like whispers in the wind. He quickened his pace, his curiosity and unease growing by the second. As he neared the summit, he stopped in his tracks. There, standing at the edge of the cliff, was a figure. It was a man, but something was horribly wrong. The man was dressed in torn clothes, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only a silent scream that seemed to echo in the stillness of the mountain. He was standing perfectly still, staring out into the vast emptiness beyond the cliff. John froze, his blood running cold. The man didn't acknowledge him, didn't seem to notice his presence at all. The dragging footsteps continued, but they weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from behind him. John turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. The trail behind him, the path he had just walked, was empty. No one was there, but the footsteps, the dragging footsteps continued, growing louder with every passing second. The air grew heavier, colder. The wind, which had been gentle before, now howled through the trees, sending a chill through John's bones. The figure at the cliff edge didn't move, didn't react. It was as though he was waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, the moaning stopped, replaced by a sharp, inhuman scream that echoed across the ridge. John felt a wave of terror wash over him as the scream reverberated in his chest. He took a step back, his legs shaking. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick, charged with an unnatural energy. Without thinking, John turned and ran. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The fear that gripped him was overwhelming, and all he could focus on was getting away from whatever that figure was. The footsteps resumed, now behind him, closer than ever. He could feel the presence of something, someone, right on his heels, following him, chasing him. He didn't stop to catch his breath, didn't stop to check the trail. He just ran, stumbling over rocks and debris, the darkness of the forest closing in around him. The sound of the dragging footsteps never left, always behind him, always getting closer. It wasn't until he reached the base of the trail that John finally dared to look back. The figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound now was the wind rustling through the trees, the silence settling back over the mountain. John was breathing heavily, drenched in sweat despite the cold air. His heart was racing, and his hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to check the time. It had been hours since he had last checked. He had lost track of time entirely. He made his way back to the trailhead in a daze, his mind racing with what he had just experienced. The figure, the footsteps, the screams. All of it felt surreal, like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, in all his years of hiking. When John finally reached his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, that something was still out there, watching him. He got into his car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. It was then that he noticed something strange. On the passenger seat next to him was a single, muddy footprint. It was fresh. The dirt was still wet, as if someone had just stepped inside the car. John didn't wait. He started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The road stretched before him, empty and silent, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Echoes of the lost hiker. It was late winter in 2016 when Rebecca Taylor, an enthusiastic hiker from San Diego, set out to explore the famous Mount Baldy Trail in the San Gabriel Mountains. Known for its challenging terrain and stunning views, Mount Baldy had become a favorite among experienced hikers and adventurers. Despite the cold temperatures and the heavy snow that had accumulated over the past few weeks, Rebecca was eager to take on the challenge. After all, she had hiked many trails in the area before, and nothing ever seemed too daunting for her. Rebecca had been planning this hike for weeks. She had read all the necessary guides, checked the weather reports, and packed all the essential gear for the cold mountain environment. She was a seasoned hiker, and this trail, despite its reputation for being difficult and often dangerous, didn't scare her. In fact, she welcomed the solitude and sense of accomplishment she would feel once she reached the summit. On the morning of her hike, Rebecca woke up early, long before the sun had risen, and drove up the winding mountain roads to the trailhead. The air was crisp and cool as she unloaded her gear and began her hike. The trail was quiet, with only the occasional crunch of snow underfoot to break the silence. As she ascended, the trail became steeper, and the snow grew thicker, making it more difficult to find a solid footing. Despite the difficulty, Rebecca felt a sense of peace. The stillness of the mountain, the pure silence broken only by the sound of her breath and her boots crunching on the snow, was a welcome escape from the chaos of her everyday life. She had always found solace in nature, and the mountain, with its towering trees and distant peaks, seemed to embrace her. Hours passed, and Rebecca made steady progress up the mountain. The higher she climbed, the more isolated she felt. The trail was becoming narrower, and the snow was deepening, making it harder to discern the path. But Rebecca didn't mind. She trusted her instincts and continued on, determined to reach the summit before nightfall. As the day wore on, the weather began to shift. The sun, which had been shining brightly in the morning, was now obscured by thick, dark clouds. A cold wind picked up, whipping through the trees and sending flurries of snow into the air. The temperature dropped, and Rebecca's breath fogged in front of her face as she trudged on, the wind biting at her cheeks and nose. It was around mid-afternoon when Rebecca reached a section of the trail she didn't recognize. The snow had covered most of the markers, and she had lost sight of the familiar trail signs. She paused, pulling out her map and checking her GPS, but there was no signal. Her phone was useless in this remote part of the mountain. As she stood there, scanning her surroundings, she heard something in the distance. Faint at first, like the sound of someone calling her name. She paused, confused. No one else was supposed to be on the trail today. She hadn't passed anyone since the morning. The wind could play tricks on the mind, making it seem like voices were drifting through the air. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was real. She strained her ears, listening closely. There it was again, her name, faint and distant, as though someone was trying to get her attention. Rebecca? The voice sounded weak, almost desperate. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't alone. She hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, but now there was someone else out here, someone who was calling her name. Her first instinct was to shout back, but a sense of caution held her back. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't place the voice, and yet it felt so familiar. She called out tentatively, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, only the faint echo of her own voice bouncing off the snow-covered slopes. She waited for a moment, but nothing came. Shaking her head, Rebecca continued along the trail, trying to dismiss the feeling that something was wrong. She had been alone in the wilderness countless times before, and her mind often played tricks on her when the silence became too oppressive. But the voice continued, growing louder, clearer, and more urgent. "Rebecca, help!" Rebecca stopped in her tracks. Her heart raced, her breath quickened. The voice was coming from somewhere off the trail, deep in the forest. She looked around, trying to locate the source, but the dense trees and heavy snow made it impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Without thinking, Rebecca began to move off the trail, drawn by the voice. She felt an inexplicable pull, as if she had no choice but to follow. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way through the trees, calling out, "Is someone out there? Are you okay?" There was no response, but the voice seemed to be growing closer, as if the person, whoever they were, was moving just ahead of her. She followed the sound of the voice deeper into the forest, the landscape becoming more unfamiliar with each step. The trees were dense here, their branches heavy with snow, blocking much of the light. The wind howled, carrying the faint echoes of the voice, but still, Rebecca couldn't see anyone. After what felt like hours, Rebecca came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a figure, someone lying motionless in the snow. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed forward, her boots slipping in the deep snow. The figure appeared to be unconscious, their body partially covered by the snow, as if they had collapsed and been left there. Rebecca knelt beside them, checking for signs of life. The person was wearing a heavy winter jacket, but their face was pale and covered in frost. She gently shook them, trying to rouse them from whatever state they were in. "Hey, are you okay? Can you hear me?" The figure stirred slightly but didn't respond. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what to do. She had no phone signal, and she was miles from the nearest help. But she knew she couldn't leave the person here. She struggled to lift them, her muscles aching under the effort. But as she tried to move them, something strange happened. The person's body seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if they were being pulled away from her, slipping further into the snow. Rebecca froze, her breath caught in her throat. She glanced down, but the figure had disappeared. She blinked in confusion, staring at the empty spot where the person had been just moments before. The voice, which had been so clear just a moment ago, was now completely silent. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sign of the person, no evidence that they had ever been there at all. Rebecca stood up, her mind racing. Had she imagined the whole thing? The voice? The person in the snow? She looked around, but the forest seemed eerily quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. The trail was still nowhere in sight, and the snow was falling harder now, blanketing the forest in a thick layer of white. She felt a sudden unease settle in her chest. There was something wrong here, something that she couldn't explain. The feeling of being watched crept over her, and she spun around, scanning the shadows between the trees. The silence stretched on, and as the wind picked up again, the haunting voice returned. This time it was closer, so close that Rebecca felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Rebecca? She whirled around, but there was no one there. The vanishing echoes of Black Bear Canyon. In the summer of 2015, Jake Thompson, a seasoned hiker and nature enthusiast from Sacramento, embarked on a solo hiking trip to the infamous Black Bear Canyon. Nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Black Bear Canyon had long been known for its rugged beauty and eerie reputation. Despite the warnings from locals about strange occurrences in the area, disorienting echoes, disorienting voices, and hikers disappearing without a trace, Jake was undeterred. He had always believed that nature was a sanctuary, free from the superstitions that often surrounded it. Jake had hiked through many challenging trails across the country, but there was something about Black Bear Canyon that intrigued him. The towering cliffs, the deep ravines, and the haunting stillness of the place seemed to draw him in. He had read about the canyon's history and the many people who had lost their way in the labyrinthine maze of trails. Despite the myths and stories, he felt a strange pull to experience it for himself. It was early morning when Jake began his hike, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was crisp and fresh, and the forest around him seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds. Jake carried his backpack, loaded with the essentials: water, snacks, a map, and his trusty compass. He was well prepared and confident in his abilities, or so he thought. As he ventured deeper into the canyon, the terrain became more challenging. The trail grew steeper, and the trees thicker, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The further Jake went, the more isolated he felt. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence that hung heavily in the air. Hours passed, and Jake pressed on. He had reached a section of the canyon where the trail narrowed, winding through jagged rocks and over uneven ground. The cliffs on either side of him rose steeply, casting long shadows that added to the growing sense of unease. Every now and then he thought he heard something. A faint rustle in the underbrush, a distant thud. But whenever he stopped and listened, all was silent again. The deeper he ventured, the more disoriented he became. The canyon was like a maze, its twisting paths leading him in every direction. Jake checked his map, but the landmarks didn't seem to align with what he saw around him. He consulted his compass, but the needle spun erratically, as if it had a mind of its own. He had been hiking for hours, yet the landscape remained strangely unchanged. As the sun began to dip behind the cliffs, Jake realized that he had lost track of time. He should have set up camp by now, but the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. His initial excitement began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. He had come this far, he couldn't turn back now. He pushed forward, hoping to find a clearing or a sign of the trailhead. But the further he went, the more the canyon seemed to close in around him. It wasn't until nightfall that Jake stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. He had been walking for what felt like hours when he came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old wooden cabin, its walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him inside. Despite the eerie sight, Jake felt an odd pull toward the cabin. It seemed out of place, as if it had been abandoned for years. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The cabin appeared empty, but there was something unsettling about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jake stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows across the room. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved through the cabin, scanning the space for anything of interest. The walls were bare, save for a few old tools scattered on a shelf. There was a fireplace on one wall, its stone mantel cracked and worn. In the corner of the room, however, was something that caught his attention. An old, weathered journal resting on a small wooden table. He picked it up, dusting off the cover. The journal was bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age. As he opened it, he was struck by the strange symbols and sketches that filled the pages. The writing was disjointed, almost frantic, and seemed to describe the very canyon he was standing in. There were accounts of lost hikers, of strange whispers in the night, and of figures seen at the edge of the woods. But it was the final entry that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Asterisk, the echoes are getting louder. I can hear them following me, whispering my name. I tried to leave, but the canyon won't let me go. I'm trapped here. If you find this, don't follow the echoes. Don't listen to them. They will lead you to the same fate. Asterisk. Jake's hand trembled as he closed the journal. He felt a wave of unease wash over him. The stories in the journal sounded like the ramblings of a madman, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. The words felt too real, too close to his own experience in the canyon. He quickly placed the journal back on the table and made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a distant sound, a faint whisper, like a voice calling his name. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as the voice grew louder, it was unmistakable. Jake. The voice was soft, almost seductive, and it seemed to come from all directions. His heart raced as he looked around, but there was no one there, just the dense trees, the jagged rocks, and the silent, oppressive darkness. Jake, come to us. The voice was growing louder now, almost pleading. It echoed through the canyon, reverberating off the cliffs and the trees. Jake felt his legs begin to tremble. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he had to leave. The canyon was playing tricks on him, and he had to get out before it swallowed him whole, just like the others. He turned to run, but the whispering grew even louder, surrounding him, overwhelming his senses. The air seemed to press in on him, suffocating him. The canyon had come alive, and it wasn't going to let him go. As Jake sprinted down the trail, the whispers followed him. They grew louder with every step, until they were no longer whispers but full-fledged voices, calling to him, taunting him, urging him to follow them deeper into the canyon. He stumbled, his feet slipping on the loose gravel, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. But the more he ran, the more disoriented he became. The trail seemed to twist and turn in impossible directions, leading him deeper into the heart of the canyon. His compass was useless, and his phone had no signal. The whispers surrounded him, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Jake stumbled into another clearing. But this one was different. The trees were twisted, their branches gnarled and skeletal, and the ground was covered in thick, black mist. He could barely see in front of him, but he could feel something. Something watching him, something that wasn't human. And then he heard it. A voice, soft and echoing, came from the mist. It was a voice he had heard before, the same voice that had been calling his name. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. "Come closer." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The voice was right there, so close now, but he couldn't see who or what was speaking. The mist swirled around him, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, he felt a tug at his arm, a cold, invisible hand pulling him toward the mist. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His legs wouldn't move, as if something was holding him in place. Then, without warning, the mist parted, revealing the dark shape of something standing in front of him. It was tall, its form distorted, its features hidden in the darkness. The voice echoed once more, but this time, it wasn't just calling his name. It was laughing, and then everything went black. The haunting shadows of Silent Creek. It was an unusually warm day in early October when Ben Harper, a young man with a passion for exploring remote places, decided to hike through the remote Silent Creek Valley in Northern California. Ben had heard whispers about the eerie reputation of the area, an isolated, dense forest deep within the Sierra Nevada, where locals claimed to have seen strange shadows and heard unsettling sounds that had no explanation. The place was rarely visited, and the stories of disappearances over the years had only heightened the mystique of the region. But Ben, always seeking a new adventure, was undeterred by these ominous tales. He had hiked alone before, traversing many remote areas of the state, so he was no stranger to navigating rugged terrains. He spent weeks preparing for this particular hike, studying maps of the area, reading forums and blogs about Silent Creek, and even consulting with other experienced hikers who had been to the region. Despite the strange stories, he was determined to uncover the truth and experience it for himself. On the morning of his hike, Ben set off from the small town of Pinewood, where he had rented a cabin for the weekend. He loaded his gear into his truck, including his camera, camping supplies, and a hiking staff for support on the uneven paths. He had no plans to stay out for more than a day, but he was excited to explore the woods and the hidden creek that was said to be at the heart of the valley. The road leading to Silent Creek was narrow and winding, lined with tall trees that seemed to close in around him as he drove further from civilization. The deeper he went, the more the world around him seemed to grow still. By the time he parked his truck at the trailhead, the air was thick with silence. There was no wind, no birds, no rustling of leaves. It felt almost as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Ben shrugged off the feeling and grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. He set off down the trail, the first few steps feeling familiar and comforting as he ventured into the dense woods. The path was overgrown in places, with tall grasses brushing against his legs and thick bushes obscuring parts of the trail. But Ben was experienced enough to follow the markers along the way, a series of faint trail signs that guided him deeper into the valley. Hours passed, and as Ben made his way further into the forest, the trees grew taller and more imposing. The sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in shadows. The temperature dropped, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him, the coolness creeping into his bones. Even though it was still early afternoon, the place felt timeless, as if it was suspended in a perpetual twilight. Around midday, Ben reached a small clearing near a fast-moving stream. The creek was gurgling and splashing over smooth stones, its water clear and cool. He paused for a moment to take a drink from his water bottle, sitting on a large rock by the water's edge. As he rested, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, scanning the woods, but there was nothing, just the dense trees and the whispering stream. Shrugging off the sensation, Ben continued his hike, determined to reach Silent Creek before the evening. The trail grew steeper, and the dense underbrush became thicker. The sounds of the forest had started to change. The usual hum of insects and birds was absent, replaced by an eerie quietness. It was as if the woods had been drained of all life. The air felt heavier, thicker, and with every step Ben took, it seemed as though the forest grew darker, more oppressive. By the time he reached the base of a steep hill, the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The sky above had turned a dull gray, the clouds swirling ominously, blocking out the last remnants of light. Ben checked his watch. He had lost track of time, and realized that he had hiked further than he had planned. There was no turning back now. He began his ascent, carefully navigating the slippery rocks and loose dirt. As he neared the top of the hill, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he saw something move in the distance, a fleeting shadow that disappeared into the trees. He paused, heart pounding in his chest. At first, he thought it was a deer or some other animal, but there was something unsettling about the way the shadow moved. It was too quick, too deliberate. Ben squinted into the fading light, but the woods remained still. The sensation of being watched intensified, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the growing sense of unease. It was just the isolation playing tricks on him. He reached the top of the hill and looked down into the valley below. The view was breathtaking, but it sent a chill through him nonetheless. The valley seemed endless, the trees stretching far into the horizon, the creek snaking through the landscape like a dark ribbon. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. In the distance, near the edge of the valley, there was a cluster of figures, shadowy and indistinct. They appeared to be standing still, watching him. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, but the figures were gone, vanished as quickly as they had appeared. His mind raced, but before he could process what had just happened, he heard something, a low, guttural sound that echoed from deep within the forest. It was a moan, a distant cry, like the wind had been twisted into something unnatural. Ben's stomach churned, and a sudden panic began to rise in him. He turned quickly, but there was no sign of the figures, no explanation for the noise. The forest was silent again, too silent. He hurried down the trail, his steps quickening, eager to leave the strange feeling behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness in the forest grew deeper. The trail became harder to follow, and the once familiar path now seemed alien, as if it were changing before his eyes. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that danced at the edges of his vision. Ben tried to focus, but every time he looked away, the darkness seemed to grow closer. By the time he reached the foot of the next hill, night had fully descended, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The sounds of the creek had faded into the background, replaced by a low, whispering noise that seemed to surround him. It was a sound unlike any he had ever heard, like voices murmuring in the distance, but they were unintelligible. Ben's heart raced as he scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming now. Suddenly, Ben froze. A figure stepped into the path ahead of him. A man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a hood. The man was motionless, standing perfectly still as if waiting for Ben to approach. Ben took a cautious step forward, his voice trembling as he called out, "Hello? Are you lost?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Ben took another step, his unease growing. The whispers around him seemed to intensify, swirling through the air. As he approached the man, the figure raised its head slightly, and Ben saw its face. A hollow, empty stare, the eyes black and unblinking. The air around Ben grew colder, and he felt a deep, gnawing dread crawl through his chest. Without thinking, Ben turned and ran, pushing through the brush, his breath ragged. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. His mind raced, but the path was dark, and he couldn't see anything ahead of him. The trail had disappeared completely, and he was lost in the dense woods, disoriented and terrified. The whispers became clearer now, calling his name in a chorus of voices that filled the air. He stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him as the ground seemed to shift. In that moment, Ben realized with growing horror that he was not alone. Not just the figure, but something far worse, something far older, was hunting him. He could hear the whispers, the voices, closing in around him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Ben collapsed onto the cold ground, his body shaking with fear, his breath ragged and shallow. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, he realized that Silent Creek had claimed another lost soul. Thank you for listening to the story until the very end. I hope you have a peaceful sleep and sweet dreams. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on the next terrifying tale. Good night.